Over the past several years, it's become increasingly clear that it's important to move beyond the war on terror. But why has the war on terror been so frustrating and oftentimes so futile? We've been conducting some research at the University of Chicago. We're publishing this in a new book called Cutting the Fuse, published by the University of Chicago Press, that helps to answer some of these core questions. In 2005, Donald Rumsfeld put it best when he asked, are we producing more terrorists than we're killing? Well, at the time, we didn't have good data on terrorism, certainly before and after that point. We do today, and especially about the kind of terrorism, suicide terrorism, which is the most deadly threat that we face. You see, suicide terrorism is the lung cancer of terrorism. It's the most deadly form of the phenomenon. It's the element of suicide attack that made it possible for the hijackers on 9/11 to kill 3,000 people. And in general, suicide attacks kill over a dozen times as many people as an ordinary terrorist attack. And also, suicide attacks, much like lung cancer, are associated with a specific trigger, something that we can do something about. Well, let's just answer Donald Rumsfeld's question. To answer it, we put together a research team at the University of Chicago. It's a rather large team, over a dozen people. They speak key native languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Tamil, Russian, all the languages that you'd associate with suicide terrorism, to try to really get at the statistics. What's really happening with suicide terrorism over time? Well, in the year 2000, there were just 20 suicide attacks around the world. One was anti-American, the Cole. Last year, 2009, there were over 300 suicide attacks around the world, 270 anti-American inspired. As we can see, we clearly are producing more terrorists than we're killing. And why? What's happening to drive that outcome? Well, our research team has collected the largest database of suicide attacks around the world ever assembled by any government or any think tank. It starts in 1980, it goes to the end of 2009, and has 2,200 suicide terrorist attacks that we have corroborated. No anonymous internet chat room. We have multiple sources corroborating each and every one of these suicide attacks, defined in the classic sense you would expect of an individual killing himself or herself on a mission to kill others. And what we find is that 98% of all those suicide attacks are driven not by a religion. In fact, we have many hundreds of purely secular suicide attacks. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka were one of the largest suicide terrorist groups in the world for many years, and they're a Hindu group, not an Islamic group, a Marxist group, a secular group. They did many suicide attacks, more than Hamas. Instead of religion, what those 98% of suicide attacks have in common is a response to foreign military forces on territory that the terrorists prize. From Lebanon and the West Bank back then to Afghanistan and Iraq today, the core goal of suicide terrorists is to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms, I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, and armored vehicles from territory the terrorists prize. We can see this in many of the suicide terrorist campaigns that we have witnessed. Let's pick Lebanon. Many of people listening to this video will be already familiar with Hezbollah, the famous suicide terrorist group. Well, in June 1982, Hezbollah did not exist. In June 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat soldiers, 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 1 month later, Hezbollah was born. Then, over the next year, for reasons we're still not quite sure why, Hezbollah began to experiment with suicide attacks. And the fourth suicide attack was the famous suicide truck bombing of our Marines in Beirut, killing 241 U.S. Marines in October '83. The same day, Hezbollah also did a suicide attack against the French, killing 58 French soldiers. Well, Ronald Reagan, no pacifist, responded by withdrawing all American combat forces from Lebanon in 1984. The French left when we did, and then Israel withdrew, first to a 6-mile security zone in the south of the country by 1986, and then, since May 2000, Israel's army left Lebanon altogether. And what's crucial about those withdrawals is that Hezbollah suicide attackers did not follow the Americans to New York, or the French to Paris, or even the Israelis to Tel Aviv. Since May 2000, there has not been a single Hezbollah or even Lebanese suicide attack. Not even during the summer of 2006, when there was a 3-week air war between Hezbollah and Israel. So if this was just about Islamic fundamentalists looking for any excuse for a quick trip to heaven, that summer of 2006, we should have seen hundreds of Hezbollah suicide attackers, and that's not the pattern that we saw. The pattern